Hello, family, and welcome to another episode of the Prescription for Better Living podcast. As always, I'm Dr. Hernando Carter, your board-certified internal medicine physician, yes, your primary care extraordinaire. And welcome to episode 23 of the Prescription for Better Living podcast, where our goal is to discuss all things health and wellness in a hip and relatable way. We are here to do this so that our community can live longer, healthier, happier, and higher quality lives. So, if you are a new viewer and subscriber to the PBL podcast, welcome. If you are a returning viewer and thus PBL family, thank you. But either way, you know what I need you to do. I need you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. I need you to like the video. I need you to comment on the video. I need you to share the video and stand on the tallest mountaintop you can and scream to the top of your lungs, hallelujah, Dr. Carter is here. If you value what we're doing here and you want to support the work that we're doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that. You can become a member of our Patreon family for just $5 per month. And as a member of our Patreon family, let me tell you what you get. You get behind the scenes access to recording of future episodes of our podcast. You get increased engagement from yours truly. And you get participation in regular wellness support group calls. I think that's a good value. Even if you don't want to do that, or if you want to do that and support in other ways, you can sponsor episodes of our podcast. Do you have a business? Do you have an event coming up? You just want a shout out? You can be an episode sponsor. And you can do that by emailing us at contact@rxforbetterliving.org, contact@rxforbetterliving.org. That's contact@rx4betterliving.org. We will always keep this podcast free because our goal is to improve the health and quality of life of members in our community. And the best way to do that is the free and wide dissemination of information and the reduction of barriers. And we would not put up a barrier such as a financial cost to this podcast. But it does cost money. So thank you in advance for your support. As I said, this is episode 23. And as always, I like to take a journey and you know where we've been thus far. We have really talked about our community's mistrust of the medical industrial complex. And we've talked about some of those historical things that have happened in our community that have sown the seeds of mistrust. We've talked about the Tuskegee syphilis study. We've talked about the mothers of gynecology, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and Dr. J. Marion Sims, who was the surgeon who experimented on these enslaved women. And on our last episode, we discussed the case of Henrietta Lacks and those HeLa cells, which have been so beneficial to science and to healthcare, but they were not procured in what we would consider now an ethical fashion. But because of Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee syphilis study and similar cases, we now have ethical standards that we follow as relates to research. So we wanted to talk about those historical things that happened to acknowledge, first of all, their existence. In this day and age, you cannot take for granted that people will actually acknowledge history, right? And so it was very important to level set and actually just discuss real history. But in discussing that real history, we had to examine what lays at the foundation of the Black community's mistrust of the medical industrial complex. And so whether or not any of us were living during the times of the mothers of gynecology, or even during the Tuskegee syphilis study, our relatives and our ancestors were, and they passed down that history and that legacy of mistrust from generation to generation. And so it was important to tackle that. We also wanted to make sure that viewers of this podcast really understood the true, factual, historical nature of these events. Because one thing that was clear during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic was that people had mistrust, and they knew that they mistrusted the medical industrial complex, at least in part because of Tuskegee and because of Henrietta Lacks. But one thing that was also very clear is that people did not really have a factual understanding of what really took place. And so we wanted to make sure that you were literate in the facts and history of what happened. So we acknowledged that, but then we started talking about how things are different. And that's where we are now. That's where we have landed at episode 23. And the purpose of this episode is to encourage people from the Black community, our community, to participate in scientific research, in medical research and trials. And we kind of got into some of the benefits behind that in our last episode. And we talked on some of the reasons why I believe we should have an increased number of African American participants in research trials. Remember, the first thing that we said is that you really want a fair, equitable, and realistic examination of whatever the question is, right? You want to have a realistic inclusivity in those studies so that those research studies can reflect what society looks like. In research studies today, the majority of the participants are white. But those findings that they apply in the research studies, they apply to everybody across the board, whether you're Black, white, yellow, red, or brown. And that may not always be the best science. We don't know. We need to know. The next thing is that we talked about this in the last episode, is that this day and age, those individuals who participate in the clinical trials typically have a better outcome than those who don't participate in clinical trials. Well, why is that, Hernando? I'm glad you asked. It is because the clinical trials tend to be the more cutting edge, using the most recent and relevant science. Also, when you participate in a clinical trial, you are watched more closely, and you get a lot of times more than or better than the average medical care because you are in a research trial. Also, if you're in a research trial, a lot of times you don't have to worry about the barrier of cost in healthcare and expense, because if you are participating in a clinical trial, then more than likely the expense of your healthcare is going to be covered as it relates to that condition in the trial. And so this day and age, it actually benefits you better, or benefits you more. Let's say, for example, if you're diagnosed with cancer and you are at a cancer research hospital and you participate in a clinical trial, you're likely to get more cutting edge treatment. So These are the reasons why. And we just need to have scientific integrity. And the way to have scientific integrity is to make sure that your study, whatever that clinical trial is an actual accurate reflection of what the community looks like. So those are some of the reasons why we want to promote increased research participation in our community. Well, how do you do that, Hernando? I'm glad you asked how you do that. We have to, again, address the real and present danger of mistrust of the medical industrial complex, of the healthcare system. There was a study that was published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine in September of 1999. And the title of this study was Attitudes and Beliefs of African Americans Towards Participation in Research. So you can just Google Attitudes and Beliefs of African Americans towards participation in research, or some derivation of that. You can Google the Journal of General Internal Medicine, 1999, and look up African Americans in research, and you'll be able to come across this study and read it for yourself. But the objective of this study was to describe barriers to participation in research by African Americans. And this was in 1999. And we are in 2024. And we're still trying to tackle this problem. And what this study found was that the mistrust that existed in the African American community was based off of a real perception, a real and true perception of human right violations that have been perpetrated against members of the African American community historically by the medical industrial complex or the healthcare industry. So this was real, right? I mean, we know that Tuskegee happened. We know that Henrietta Lacks happened, and so on and so forth. But what this study found was that all were misinformed about the historical facts, specifically and particularly the Tuskegee syphilis study. So while all of them cited Tuskegee syphilis study as the main reason why they did not trust medical research or clinical trials, all of them were misinformed about the historical facts of Tuskegee. Fortunately, I can say that this audience is not misinformed about the historical facts of Tuskegee. Why? Because we talked about that in detail. So just go back a few episodes if you missed it, and you can receive the real to real about Tuskegee. So this study in the Journal of General Internal Medicine found that all of the study participants, when looking at attitudes and beliefs of African Americans towards research, all of the participants were misinformed about historical facts. Few of the people who were interviewed for the Journal of General Internal Medicine understood what informed consent is. Few of them did. Again, not in this audience. If you've been watching us over the last several episodes, you understand what informed consent is. And you understand that informed consent was put in place as a buffer to what happened in Tuskegee and similar things like Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells. Again, go back and look at those episodes if you missed them and you want to know more. When it came to informed consent, a lot of the participants in this study did not trust signing a document because they thought that signing the document would relinquish their autonomy, and it was somehow put in place not to protect them, but to protect the doctors and the researchers. And the opposite is true, right? We know that informed consent was put in place for the benefit and the protection of the individual who is actually participating in the clinical trial and not the researcher. Okay. And remember, we talked about IRBs, internal review boards, and those safety nets that were put in place. So, why, Hernando, do you think it's important for African Americans to participate in clinical trials? I'm glad you asked, and I already said some of the reasons why at the beginning of this episode, but then also in previous episodes. But let me tell you about clinical trials as they exist today. 75% of those individuals who participate in clinical trials today are white, while 60% of Americans are white. So that is an overrepresentation of white Americans in clinical research. 8% of study participants in clinical trials in America are Black. 8. While we as Black people make up 13% of the U.S. population. That is an underrepresentation of African Americans in research studies. Why is that important? I'm glad you asked, but I've told you before, if you want to have good science, and if you want to have results of clinical trials that are as reflective as we can get of a representation of our country, and therefore more broadly and accurately applicable to the patient population in this country, you need equal representation. To put it in layman's terms, if you want to ensure that whatever you're studying is going to be as beneficial to Black people as it is to white people, you need more Black people in the studies, right? Well, there are a lot of people that agree that participation of African Americans in clinical trials is important. And it's not just me. In 2015, the NAACP did a resolution about the importance of increasing African American participation in research studies and clinical trials. And one of the things that they referenced is sickle cell disease. Now, we know that sickle cell disease pretty much, exclusively affects people in the Black community. But if we don't have enough of our people participating in research, then that hinders our ability to come up with new and innovative ways to treat this dreaded disease. So that's just one example. So just Google NAACP 2015 resolution on Blacks in research, and you'll be able to read that for yourself. So we've talked about what we need to do. And so the question is, how do we do it? And as always, it's not a simple cookie cutter answer, right? It's complex and is multifaceted. There are many layers and tentacles to this octopus. But one of the first things we have to do as physicians and scientists is we have to build trust in the Black community. And right now we don't have it. We got to build trust. We got to get people to trust us. Trust that we are going to have their best interest in mind. And also trust that there are safety nets and safeguards in place that are going to protect them and help oversee the researchers. So kind of trust but verify. Well, how do you build trust? Well, you have to partner with community leaders and community organizations that already have a stakeholder in the community. We implemented this with COVID-19 and trying to combat misinformation and promote vaccination. We use trusted messengers. So we partnered with pastors and community leaders, the Divine Nine. And if you are challenged in melanin, Divine Nine are the Black Greek letter organizations in the Black community who really hold, in most communities, a place of esteem and trust because we, and I'm a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, we are already in the communities doing the work all the time. Community service, cleaning up communities, feeding members of the community, providing during the holidays, mentoring, giving scholarships, being civically engaged, voter registration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so partnering with those trusted messengers in the community to first gain their trust, give them the information, answer the hard questions asked by them because they are the gatekeepers. Once you've earned their trust, train them to spread the message. So trusted messengers, partnering with community leaders and community organizations. We have to be clear in our explanation of the benefits of research as we try to do on this podcast. We have to address historical mistrust and what has happened. We can't glance over it. We can't minimize it. We can't poo-poo people's mistrust. We just got to take it head on. Talk about, yes, it happened. Make sure that people understand what actually happened, the true facts. And then talk about why things are different now as opposed to then, why things are safer now as opposed to then, and why it's actually more beneficial now to participate in clinical trials as opposed to then. We have to provide accessible and understandable information regarding the trials. We have to be able to clearly articulate what the trial is about, what is the thing or question we're trying to answer or the problem we're trying to fix, how we're going to go by doing it, what are the risks and benefits, and how are they going to be helping themselves, but also science. But we have to do it in a relatable way. Like we say, we discuss all things health and wellness in a hip and relatable way. We can't use medical and scientific jargon. We can't use a lot of technical jargon. We have to be able to do it in layman's terms. And believe it or not, a lot of physicians, clinicians, and researchers are super smart. But with all of that intelligence and with all of that training, the many, many years of academic and scientific training, sometimes we forget just how to talk like regular people, right? And so that's an art we have to discover. You also have to ensure that the research teams are diverse. So remember, we talked in episodes about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the dangers of that becoming a bad phrase. One of the ways to get more Black people to participate in clinical trials is to have more Black people actually doing the clinical trials, because there's that mutual trust there. And we're going to understand just from jump, from the word go, we're going to understand the barriers that we have to overcome, some of the misconceptions, and we're going to be able to talk to them as members of the community as, again, another trusted messenger as to here's why you should participate in research. We have to make access to research, particularly access to signing up for research, flexible and more accessible, because more members of our community are, clock in, clock out, shift workers, etc. And it's a big deal just to get off to go to the doctor just for your regular checkup, right? Let alone all the visits that are involved in participating in a research study. So make it more accessible. Include options for participation through telephone, online, as well as in person. Also, make it worth people's while. Incentives and compensation. Compensating them for their time, for their gas, for meals, etc. So increasing incentives and compensation. Have more community-based research. So instead of them having to leave their community and go to the big ivory tower or the big medical complex, come and bring the research to them in their communities, at their community centers, at their churches, etc., in their schools. Be respectful. Be respectful. Big way to lose the trust of people in our community is that if we perceive that you don't respect us. And it's in the way you behave, it's in the way you speak at us. Be respectful and build relationships. So don't just show up when you got a new study. Be there. Support the community fundraiser, the community event, things that are going on in the community, the basketball tournament, the Men Day, Women Day, the bake sales, the church. Have your organization there present to support what's going on so that you build relationship. They see you as a value add. And so when you come with your ask, you already have a relationship and they trust you. So this was just kind of a wrap up about where we were trying to go in discussing Tuskegee and discussing DEI and discussing the mothers of gynecology and in discussing Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells. Because again, remember, I acknowledged what happened. But I'm telling you, precious people, that our community is missing out by not participating in clinical trials. We're missing out. And not only are we hurting ourselves, we're hurting our children and their children. So we gotta do the work in our community to be the messengers to encourage people. But then me, as being a part of the medical industrial complex, we got to do some work too in building trust in these communities and acknowledging what has happened in the past and explaining to folk how it's different. So this has been another episode of the Prescription for Better Living podcast. As always, I'm Dr. Hernando Carter, board certified internal medicine physician, yes, your primary care extraordinaire, saying wherever you are, wherever you go, make sure you spread the good news and tell everybody, hallelujah, Dr. Carter is here. Until next time, it's Dr. Carter saying, peace out.